Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we are here again with another great episode of Kentucky History. We have with us today Mr. Waylon Humphrey, who is the Chief of Operations of the Louisville District of the Army Corps of Engineers. How you doing?
Hey, doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to get into some very specific Kentucky history here today. I think it's pretty unique, and listeners should really enjoy this because you probably don't think about there's history for the Army Corps of Engineers in Kentucky, and there's a bunch. But before we get into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your Kentucky connection, and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Kentucky. Um, Grew up in Meade County, so in the Brandenburg area. Went to Meade County High School. Went to college in Kentucky at the University of Louisville. Did my bachelor's in mechanical engineering and my master's in engineering management. I ended up moving over to the some people call it the sunny side or the dark side, depending on where you stand of the river. I live in southern Indiana now.
Oh,
I met my wife, and we settled down over there. She was originally from that area, and so, but I'm just stone's throw away, and commute over here every day, and maybe one day we'll convince her to move back to my roots. But I still got family down in the Meade County area and the Brandenburg area, so yeah, still very tied, and go down there frequently.
yeah. We won't hold nothing against you for living in Southern Indiana. The
Uh,
big question is, though, are you a Cardinals fan?
I am absolutely a Louisville Cardinals fan. I grew up a Cardinals fan before I even I went to school there. Also tied to the university, and my wife is a professor at the School of Nursing. And so we're trying to raise I've got three young girls at home, and trying to raise them to be Cardinal fans as well. And
Oh gosh.
maybe one day they can become alumni.
The viewership and listenership is just dropping.
Yeah, we're losing a lot of UK fans. I'm one of the Louisville fans though that I will cheer on Kentucky as long as they're not playing Louisville.
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
I want what's good for the state, and
There you go.
as much as I get frustrated when we lose to the Wildcats, and want to go crawl in a hole somewhere, and then I'm equally elated when we win.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to see them succeed as well, and I think that's good for the state overall.
Well, our co-host David Kirkpatrick, who's on quite regularly, he went to Louisville too, and we invite people back on, even if they went to Louisville. Um, anyway, back to our topic. We're talking about the um, Army Corps of Engineers 250th anniversary. And if you're familiar with Kentucky history at all, there's a lot of 250th anniversaries going on now, and probably for the next 10 years, there's going to be 250th anniversaries. Harrodsburg just had theirs last year. Stanford had theirs this year, and Boonesboro. Uh, a lot of history. When we start talking about this birthday for the Army Corps of Engineers in Louisville, where do we get started with the history there? Um, what's been the presence? How's that even begin?
Yeah, so the roots of the Louisville district really started right here in the city of Louisville, and with the navigation mission and the Falls of the Ohio. So for listeners who are unaware, the Falls of the Ohio here at Louisville has a ton of history, and the navigation improvements that have been made over there for multiple generations, and multiple different iterations of infrastructure that's been built there. Um, that's where the Corps and the Louisville district specifically really got started. But the 250th anniversary of the Army Corps of Engineers as a whole, a lot of that goes back to the military mission, but the civil works, and when I say civil works, that always throws people for a loop. It's basically anything to do with water. So when you're talking about the public water, the waterways, the rivers, some of the man-made lakes that we have, anything where we're trying to take the water and either protect people from that water, or make that water useful, or protect the water from the people. There's
Yeah, yeah.
anything to do with water. So when you hear civil works, just think water. Um, but that goes back to about 200 years ago. And so when you're looking at, I think it was 1824, President Monroe had charged the Corps of Engineers with maintaining the Mississippi River and the Ohio River systems. Um, and basically, it's so hard to imagine what it was like then versus now, because the infrastructure on the Ohio River system, specifically that we're used to here in the state of Kentucky, has been in place for over 100 years. And so very few Kentuckians, unless they're over 100 years old, would remember what the river would have looked like prior to the infrastructure being placed in it. Um, but that all started out with just channel maintenance. And channel maintenance is still a mission that we do today, even with the lock and dam system that's built on the Ohio River. Um, Essentially, the Corps of Engineers, the Louisville District, or some of the other districts along the river and the waterways, were responsible for different segments of the river. So we, the Louisville District, have from up near Cincinnati down to where the Ohio dumps in to Mississippi at Cairo. And we would, as the river would fall out, so say in periods of drought or dry weather, it doesn't do like it does today. And the last few years where we've had droughts, the Ohio River system doesn't see the same impacts that all the news stories and the news coverage you were getting on the Lower Mississippi River. The Lower Mississippi River doesn't have a system of lock and dams. The channel's maintained through dredging and then through a process which is called revetment, where they essentially use dikes and jetties and try and control the channel with that. So we don't see that low water because the infrastructure is in place. But go back 200 years, when you got to a drought, the water would drop out, and there would be trees, there would be rock outcrops, there would be sandbars all in the river that would prevent flat boats, keel boats, paddle wheel boats from traversing the river and making it up and down. And so essentially they would just have to sit and wait. And then when they started back again, it was kind of a treacherous journey, because you didn't know that the depths that were there, and the rock outcrop that was previously exposed is now 2 or 3 feet under the water, and your boat's
Yeah.
strapped in 4 feet. You're going to come through and hit it. And, that's one of the things that had started the Corps of Engineers getting involved with the inland waterways in the first place. There was a big accident. I think there was like 60 people that were killed. And this was going back to the early 1800s. And
Yeah.
so you go in there, and that's where the Corps started. We would go in and have vessels that would go up and down the river and try to clean out those snags, clean out those rock outcroppings. We call them snag boats. Essentially, imagine a kind of like a barge-looking vessel with a A-frame crane on the front of it that had a hook, and they would drop down and grab the trees that were in the middle of the way and kind of pull them out. So, in general, you had that channel maintenance mission going on from 1824 through 1875. Around 1875 is when the Corps of Engineers in Louisville District really got going with McAlpin, what is now known as McAlpin. And it goes, I'm trying not to jump all over the place.
That's a yeah. Well, the Falls of the Ohio is very significant to Louisville in that early settlement, because like George Rogers Clark came in, in the early 1770s, or well, I should say later 1770s, and it was a natural place to kind of set up, because that was one of the falls. And I always have a hard time imagining, like, when you think of falls, you think of Niagara Falls or Cumberland Falls, and it really wasn't that big of a falls. I think it was just really wavy, um, unsettled terrain, I guess, or not
Yeah,
smooth
so
terrain.
the river dropped
Mhm.
26, 27 feet over the course of about 2 miles.
Wow.
And so it was more like a set of rapids, maybe more so than the falls. But I've always appreciated that because it's essentially why Louisville is developed where it is.
Exist. Yeah.
Why Portland, the part of Louisville down here is called Portland because you would portage around the falls. Um, there was Shipping Port Island that's still out there at McAlpin that um, previously had a community that was out there, and people lived and worked out there. And those travelers at the time, when the Corps in its early stages, from the early 1800s, prior to us impounding the river in the late 1800s, there was a original canal and um, three-stage lock that was built at McAlpin by a private entity before the federal government got involved. So the Louisville Portland Canal Company started in 1824, about the same time that the Corps got its general channel maintenance mission. Um, they started out there and built a three-stage lock and dug a canal, the same canal that you see today when you're driving up 64. It's just been widened and expanded multiple times as a way to navigate around the Falls of the Ohio. Because that's the reason I was talking about people having to stop and portage around and those rock outcrops during droughts. It was a treacherous place to try and navigate. And uh, the captains of the boats would um, actually stop and hire Native Americans and have them navigate their vessels through there because they were the ones who were more familiar with uh, the conditions and had the experience and the competency to take the vessels around. Um, so that's all going on. So let's just talk about the period from 1824 through 1875 ish.
Mhm.
The Corps of Engineers, as a whole, we are doing channel maintenance. We're
Yep.
going out when the Ohio River drops out. We're cleaning out the trees. We're trying to get the rocks out of the way, trying to keep it safe. At the same time, the Louisville Portland Canal Company had built those three-stage locks, dug that canal. So that was really the first locks and dams on the inland waterway system um, that
In the
allow,
country? In the
yeah,
country, maybe? Yeah, yeah.
that allowed vessels to go around. Um, and they were the largest ones in the world at the time. And then every time they would be expanded, they would end up being the largest. Um, and so that all changed in the 1875 timeframe. The private company, Louisville Portland Canal, had gone through some different iterations, and they were trying to do an expansion and ended up getting in some financial trouble. And with the Corps of Engineers taking on the navigation mission, um, the federal government assigned the Corps of Engineers responsibility of that entire area. And so that's when the Corps got the jurisdiction to take on the canal and the existing locks that were there, which were in the process of being converted from three-stage locks over to a two-stage lock. Um, so, and that all lines up with the start of the original canalization of the Ohio River. Um, so you have channel maintenance that started in the 1820s, um, but as time is progressing and the country's developing and the state's developing, you're getting to the point where, all right, you've got capacity, you've got paddle wheel steamboats now. The invention of steamboats in the 1860s are really allowing capacity to be transited up and down the river. And James Monroe was the president who assigned the Corps of Engineers that responsibility back in the 1820s. But then when we get to 1875s, um, that's when Congress looks at the Corps and says, all right, we need to come up with a way to make the Ohio River system more reliable year round. They referred to being able to take a vessel from Pittsburgh to Cairo without being impeded, other than at the falls, as coal boat stages. So you had to have perfect water conditions, essentially. where it would be deep enough to load your vessel in Pittsburgh and make it all the way to Cairo.
That sounds simple enough, right?
Right, yeah. Without any mass communication or any efficient way
Yeah.
of knowing what the weather was going to be like. Um, and so, as they're going through that, they charge the Corps of Engineers, like, "Hey, come up with a way to make this more reliable." The Corps of Engineers, long story short, comes up with this system of what's called a Wicket Dam. And this is going to be tough for me to articulate to listeners who are unfamiliar with what a Wicket Dam is. Um, but essentially, a wicket itself is a movable gate that's kind of like a big ironing board laying in the bottom of the river. And so we would go through and lay all these big wooden gates that are laying like ironing boards all the way across the bottom of the river. And then when water level started to drop out, we would use a steam powered crane and we would go out there and hook on to each individual wicket and stand it up, kind of like if you took that ironing board and stood it on
Oh,
its
yeah.
butt end and make a temporary dam.
Mhm.
And that temporary dam then would impound water upstream to give us a greater depth to the upstream project. But that system is what originally canalized the Ohio River from Pittsburgh all the way through Cairo. There was 49 of those facilities that were built. And you still see some of the remnants of that history today. So, like, if you go to some of the 52 and 53 were the last ones, and I know that doesn't line up with the numbers of 49. They had originally planned 53 of these things to be built, 49 of them ended up being constructed. But 52 and 53 are down in the Paducah area,
Mhm.
and we operated those all the way through 2018.
Oh, wow.
For, right at 90 years when the system was modernized. But backing up, like there's still some powerhouses. So the original like brick buildings that were adjacent to the lock and that Wicket Dam are still in place. We would either outgrant those or turn them over. I think there's some. Thomas More has a classroom facility in one of those. There's one that's a bed and breakfast.
Wow.
And it just depends on whether it's in southern Indiana or whether it's in Kentucky. It just depends on what side of the river the lock chamber was on. But essentially, the way that system worked from 1929 through when we modernized it and started the modernization effort around the 1950s was as same as before. When that water would start to fall out, we would go out there and start raising these wickets and create temporary dams. And what that allowed was year-round reliable navigation. We were authorized a 9-foot channel. Those locks and dams then allowed boats, regardless of what the weather was like, regardless of how dry it got, um, whatever kind of drought condition we were in, vessels could go out and leave Pittsburgh and go all the way to Cairo with reliable water. So that was a pretty tremendous accomplishment. You still see a lot of that history today. So, and that was the original uh, kind of canalization of the Ohio River, which has since now been modernized, and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
I'm sure as well. So
Well, and this question just came to me there. How much did it cost, or would you know like how much it would cost then? I guess.
I don't have the numbers of how much it cost them, but I can give you time and a time comparison
Yeah.
of what they were able to do. So that effort to build all 49 of those movable wicket dams started around late 1875, 1879 time frame and went through 1929, which is when Locking Dam 53 was completed. So roughly 50 years
Whoa, that's a
to
lot.
build. Well, yeah, it's a lot, but also you think these are gigantic structures and massive undertakings to build, and they were building these things at a rate of around. They were cranking them out about. It would take them about 5 years from start to finish, which is really incredible when you think the tools and the equipment they were doing it with. They were building cofferdams, and a cofferdam is essentially like a system of piers where you could block off a portion of the river, pump the water out of it, and have a dry area where you
Yeah.
can the lock chamber.
Yeah.
And then you would do the same thing after you built the lock chamber, you would do the same thing, build another coffer dam, and build your dam in the bottom of the river, and then remove the coffer dam, and it's all there in place. Um, and they were doing this with like mules and steam powered trains and like wagons, and so to get it done in 5 years is pretty
That's pretty
incredible.
impressive. Yeah.
And so compare that now with today, and some of this is just like it. One of the projects that we're building are much more complex. To the scale is 5 times the size of what it was then. But you also have modern safety regulations. You don't know how many people died in the process of making those,
Yeah.
churning them out, in 5 years. Um, and the funding constraints that we see as well. We don't exactly have efficient funding. You compare that to say like Olmsted Lock and Dam, which was the last one that was modernized. Olmsted, from start to finish, from the time um, the Louisville District started looking at the planning phases to cutting the ribbon, passing the first towboat through, was right at about 30 years. Um, and
Oh.
so, yeah. And so, how they were able to step through that back in the day
Yeah.
versus, what it takes today to do a similar construction effort. And not to say that the Corps, I'll be a critic of the Corps, even though I love this agency, love working for the federal government.
Mhm.
Uh, there's things we could do as an agency um, to shake that down from 30 years. And of course, we've got stakeholders who are critical of
Mhm.
how long that takes. But it's the federal government is delivering on the requirements that we're uh, bound against. Right, the Corps of
Yeah.
Engineers, we're delivering against what we're being asked to do. And so when we've got stacks of regulations that are taller than my desk, we've got to comply with. Um,
Yeah.
Yes, that makes things a little bit more complex.
Yes. Yeah, and that's understandable. Um, that is an interesting process. I mean, when you think about moving a river, I mean, basically, is what you're doing
Yeah.
is
I mean,
having
even
been a
today, like we can stand in, we'll dewater the lock chambers. My experience, I came up as a project engineer, and when we dewater a lock chamber, you've got this path of the river that is the lock, and when you dewater it, you're essentially kind of standing in the bottom of the river, and looking up at the gates and thinking like, man, there's 30, 40 feet of water on the other side of these bulkheads. But, I'm standing down essentially in the bottom of the river here.
Uh-huh.
So,
And is it whenever did they find anything cool, like, history-wise or any old relics, anything like that?
yeah, so the Corps of Engineers, we have archaeologists that work for us as well. And even today, when we're doing any construction efforts, when we do soil sampling, we do surveys, we go out. We've been talking navigation, and I'd like to. I don't want to go without mentioning some of our other missions as well. But say like our flood risk management projects. So the lakes. So if you're familiar with Taylorsville Lake, Green River Lake, Barren River Lake,
Mhm. Yeah.
Rough River, all the Army Corps of Engineers lakes in Kentucky. All those were constructed by the federal government and by the Corps of Engineers as well. But same deal there. When we do these excavations, they're on um, you know historically significant sites sometimes, right? Because it's a um, a valley next to a waterway. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah.
and where did Native Americans like to be, or along the waterway?
Yeah.
Um, and so the Corps does extensive efforts to try and survey to see what's there. If there is something that's found, Native American artifacts or whatever else, try to identify which tribe it might have belonged to, and even do ceremonies where we return it to the tribe. And then we've got a whole process of cataloging everything that's found and taking it and trying to protect it and preserve it and make sure that we're capturing that history as well, as opposed to just going out there and the bulldozers and piling the stuff over and pouring concrete. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
but even when we dewater the lock chambers now, been um, previously disturbed, and you're essentially kind of standing in a concrete pit. But yeah, you see a lot of interesting stuff like cars. I mean, you're amazed at how many vehicles end up in the river.
Oh.
Lots of tires, lots of trash. Growing up in rural Kentucky, you see some litter and debris in different places, but not until I worked on the waterway did I really have an appreciation for um, every little piece that doesn't make it into a trash can. Ultimately, or I'll say it, not every little piece, but the majority of it will find its way
Mhm.
to the water. And then our dams essentially serve as a collection point for some of that
That's
stuff. And so, yeah, you
oh.
see a lot of bottles, you see a lot of trash, a lot of stuff like that. That's kind of disheartening. But yeah, a lot of fish and a lot of rubbish.
Oh, well, yeah, yeah, I can see that, and that is a little disheartening, like, "Oh,
Yeah,
man, that's what shows up." Well, so another thing that I know, Louisville has been known for and has happened, and it's not just Louisville, I mean, there's many places, but, um, Louisville's been flooded a few times. Um, you know 1937, there's a big flood, but, there's multiple times Louisville was flooded. What does the Louisville District do for the flood prevention
yeah.
in the area?
Yeah, so it's a clear distinction when I'm talking navigation on the Ohio River. I want to make sure listeners are clear that those locks and dams. So when you hear of like McAlpin or Cannleton Lock and Dam, which is just downstream, or Markland Lock and Dam, that is the upstream project up near Cincinnati. Those navigation locks and dams only hold back water to make it deep enough upstream for boats to have a 9-foot channel. So they are not providing any flood protection, and so that's a significant piece that people need to understand because we had um, a concerned individual who lived in southern Indiana one time that was looking at McAlpin, and um, there were some normal operations that were going on. But they had a concern like, oh, if McAlpin breaks, am I going to get flooded? Um,
Mhm.
and the answer is no. If the navigation locks and dams on the Ohio River, um, God forbid, were to have an issue where they would lose, pool storage or control of the water, it's not going to flood anybody downstream. It essentially would you would lose navigating depth upstream. So that's the navigation mission, and that is in stark contrast and comparison to our flood risk management mission, which is those lakes that I'd referred to. So I'll see if I can bring this back and weave this in. So we went through and we built the canalization effort on the Ohio River system, that system of locks and dams. That was completed in 1929. All 49 of them on the river are working. Um, Steamboats are going up and down the river. We've got reliable navigation. Everything's good. So from 1929 on, things are going great. We get to 1937, and just like you mentioned, there was the flood that occurred. Um, that flood in 37, even to this day, you still see historical markings about the flood of 37. You know that there's a ton of impacts that came along with that flood. And just to put it into some context, um, the Louisville area received 19 inches of rain that January, and 15 inches of that occurred of a period of about 12 days. So it's
Ooh,
January and it is raining and it's not stopping. Um,
yeah.
and specifically, what's not in place at the time, when you see the historical pictures from the 37 flood, there's no flood walls, there's no levees, um, and there's no flood risk management lakes. This is all pre infrastructure. And so the river crested about 30 feet above the flood stage, required evacuation in Louisville of about 175,000 people. Louisville was the hardest hit, but this was widespread. You had
Mhm.
Huntington, West Virginia, Cincinnati, Ohio, anywhere along the Ohio River, Paducah, Evansville, everywhere was flooded, um, to the point where region wide there was over 400 people that lost their lives. About 1 million people in the region on the Ohio River Valley were left homeless, um, and property values at the time were measured in like $500 million in 1937 dollars. So today,
Mhm.
the number I have is from a few years ago was 8 billion. But
True.
you take that and convert it through all the inflation of the last 5 years, and I'd say you're up in the double-digit billion measure at that point.
Mhm.
So that happens, right? And again, the elected officials look to the Army Corps of Engineers as kind of the nation's engineer and say, what can we do about this? And the Corps of Engineers comes up with the Ohio River System Flood Risk Management Plan. It's a comprehensive plan that was from Pittsburgh all the way down through Cairo again, but involves the tributaries. So you see in Kentucky and all kind of specifics of Kentucky that we go through and do two phases. One of which is building flood risk management lakes, and so the strategy there is you go up onto the tributaries of the Ohio River and build lakes that serve as storage capacitors. So essentially, if you've ever been out to any of our lakes, people will often ask us, "Well, why do you draw it down in the wintertime? Why can't
Mhm.
you leave it where it is in the summer?"
Yeah.
And that strategy is so that we have more capacity to store water. So if you're at Nolan River Lake in December or January, you will notice it looks much different. It looks much more like Nolan River Pond or Nolan.
Yeah.
Um, and that is all primarily, for the or for the primary purpose of the lake, which is flood risk management. And so we draw down that water elevation in preparation of the spring rains and the flooding that occurred in January in 37, so that when it does start raining, we can capture that water. And so we store it in the lake as the water rises. We don't let it out of the lake. We capture it in the lake. And then as the water starts to drain out downstream in the Ohio River, then we start letting it out of the lake. And so
Mhm.
we essentially meter out that water from that capacitor. Um, and so there's a system. There was 84 flood risk management lakes that were built on the Ohio River Basin. And I don't have so the ones that are in Kentucky that I'm responsible for in the Louisville District. You've got Nolan, Barron, Green, Ruff, Taylorsville, Cave Run, Carr Creek, Buckhorn, which are kind of on the eastern end of the state. And so when you see the flooding that's occurred here recently, even in the eastern Kentucky area, like devastation, um, it's it's hard for us as an agency to communicate the benefits of these projects when people are currently suffering consequences from flooding. Right. So
Yeah.
our,
Yeah.
our public affairs office has a, a delicate balance to try and walk because you don't want to put it out there like, oh, look how good of a job we're doing. We're preventing all of this flooding. And people are like, what do you mean you're preventing flooding? My house is underwater. I've got
Yeah.
to stop
Yeah.
on my own. Um, but the bottom line is it could have been a lot worse downstream of those projects if they weren't there. And for example, in the 2022 flooding that occurred in eastern Kentucky, um, Carr Creek Lake itself um, had prevented an additional 4 feet of water from being in hazard.
Oh,
And hazard was pretty
was hit
severely
hard.
impacted
Yeah.
already. It hit hard. And just that one lake prevented an additional 4 feet of water from being in there. And so it's especially significant when you start thinking about water and how much it spreads. For every foot it goes up, it goes out a lot further. You're in the mountains down there, so it doesn't go as far if it was in more flat land. But again, you don't want to brag about, oh well, we prevented it from being even worse when I'm sensitive to and feel absolutely horrible for the impacts and the people who lost businesses, who lost
Mhm.
lives, who lost everything they owned during those floods. But that's the pure purpose of those flood risk management lakes. And so they're out there, they're still in operation, they're doing their job. And so that was the first phase of that flood risk management approach post 37 flood. And the second phase was something I mentioned earlier, the flood walls and the levee system.
Yeah. Um,
They're a little bit different in that the Corps of Engineers, um, so like City of Louisville came to the Corps of Engineers mid 1950s, said, "Hey, we want to construct a flood protection system for the city of Louisville." The Corps worked with the city, designed and built the flood wall system, the pump stations, the levees, everything that's there. And rather than the Corps of Engineers owning and operating that facility, we turned it over back to the city,
mhm.
and the city owns and operates it. Um, and then if they need assistance, if something were to happen to it, then they can reach back out to the federal government and try to get some assistance doing that. So when you look at the pictures now, when the floods occur, you see the gates going into the flood walls downtown, like here recently when they put those gates in. All of that infrastructure is in place as a result of that 37 flood. That it's pretty significant, and growing up in the state and growing up along the water, I think a lot of people know that it's there and just take for granted that it hasn't always been there,
Yeah.
especially when comparing it to the 37 flood.
Yeah. What you mentioned the lakes, the preventative lakes. Where does Lake Cumberland fall in that? Um,
Yeah.
or is that part of
So,
the Kentucky system, or is that another one?
so Lake Cumberland, while it's in Kentucky, and this is something I didn't touch on earlier, it's actually in the Nashville district. And
Okay.
so the Cumberland River and the Tennessee River are the jurisdiction of the Nashville district because of if you ever were to look at a map of, say, like the Louisville District Corps of Engineers, it's
Hmm.
this odd shape. It doesn't follow the state boundaries. It essentially follows the watershed. So, like if it rains in the Nashville district, that water flows into the Cumberland River or the Tennessee River. If it rains in the Louisville district, that water flows into one of the tributaries that would ultimately, go into the Ohio River portion that we're responsible for. Um, but Lake Cumberland is a multi-purpose project. It's got, and I'm not going to go too far out of my lane here. A lot of those Nashville district projects have hydropower component. They have a navigation component from a lock chamber. They have a flood risk management component. They're preventing flooding downstream, and then of course they have recreation and environmental stewardship as well, which like our lakes in Kentucky. So I can use Nolan as a contrast.
Mhm.
Nolan has flood risk management, so we're the dam and the tower itself is there to prevent flooding downstream. Um, we've got recreation, so like the campgrounds, the facilities, the boat ramps, all that stuff that supports the recreation and the folks who want to recreate on that lake. And then environmental stewardship as well. And so environmental stewardship being when the federal government bought this land, um, built the dam, impounded the water, um, the surrounding land that's around it, we've got a mission to um, try and protect. The same way you protect your land that your house sits on, um, we do the same thing on behalf of the federal government to ensure that our neighbors don't encroach on us unintentionally,
Mhm.
or that other members of the public don't come and do damage to the property, or that invasive species don't come in and take over. There's a lot of work that ends up being done on that environmental stewardship mission as well.
So we're talking. Obviously, the Corps of Engineers does a lot of preventative damage and or damage control and so forth like that. What about the other side of it? Once something's happened, what do they come in at, or is there a process there?
Yeah, and so I'll go back and do a little more weaving. So
You're
that
doing
that
good at
original,
it.
that original lock and dam system, the Wicket Dams, they were completed in 29, and then the flood happens in 37, and then the flood risk management mission, the levees, and the flood walls, and all that stuff's being built in the mid 1950s. Another big historical advent around the mid 1900s, you have the diesel engine and diesel powered towboats that enter the river system. and capacity to move commodities just grows that much more. And oh, by the way, those original system of lock and dams, those Wicket Dams, it started in 1875-ish and was completed in 1929. We're getting some age on them,
Yeah, yeah,
and they're starting to fail, right? And so the Corps of Engineers goes through a modernization effort, and we take that system of 49 locks and dams on the Ohio River and replace those with a plan that began in 1950s of 19 facilities. So you went from 49 small steps to get from Pittsburgh to Cairo in a drought condition to now 19 kind of larger steps or moderate steps where you would go down the
yeah.
river. And so if you were to take the cross section of the river and cut it in half, it would look like a stair step during those periods of drought. And so how that applies to where we're at now. So we went through and we built that modernization system. So all the new locks and dams that were constructed from 1950s through 2018, again, about a 60-year effort from start to finish, and put that into place. And that's the system that we operate today. So if you go out to say Cannington Lock and Dam down near Leavenworth, Indiana, or down past Brandenburg, or go to Newburgh Lock and Dam, which is down near like Henderson, Kentucky area. You'll see that modernization project that's there, and again, how that ties in with failures and where we're seeing now. We completed that modernization effort in 2018 with the Olmsted project. So essentially, we started in groupings and worked our way from Pittsburgh all the way down from the 1950s through 2018, and rebuilt that system. But when it was completed in 2018, we're kind of at the same point that our predecessors were in the 1940s, 1930s. That, hey, we completed that modernization effort, but the original ones of the modernization effort now
are no longer modern.
Right, yeah. So when you're talking about infrastructure, it's tough to measure. The Ohio River is 900, in each one of these facilities. If listeners have never been, I encourage them to go out and see them and watch a boat walk through. There are millions and millions of yards of concrete that's out there in the water, and millions of pounds of steel that are in place. Each one of our a miter gate on a lock chamber, so like the gate that allows the vessel to enter the lock and then adjust the water level. So like at McAlpin, I think they're close to 300 tons each. So it's a monumental piece of steel that's sitting in the river, and there's 4 leaves in each lock chamber. And so tying it all back together, all that stuff now is getting old as well. And so what we do, right? We're in a situation where all of this infrastructure is getting beyond its design life. So you've got the majority of the projects are beyond their 50-year design life cycle. When you design infrastructure like this as an engineer, you target 50 years. You have to pick a number, and the industry standard is 50 years. Well, they're, with the exception of Olmsted and Smithland Lock and Dam, I think they're all beyond that 50-year mark now. So we're getting to the point where the failures are becoming more prevalent, and so that's what makes my job exciting, right? Like, so as the chief of operations, I'm essentially a operations and maintenance program manager is probably a different way to say it. So not only do we operate all this infrastructure on behalf of the federal government, but we maintain it as well. And the maintenance efforts that are ongoing are increasingly more capital improvement type projects. So it's not, use the analogy of a car because people are used to cars. We're not doing oil changes and we're still doing our oil changes. We're still replacing our windshield wipers. We're still doing all that stuff. But some of the failures we're starting to see now is like, all right, the transmission's going out. The engine needs to be replaced. The frame has some damage. It needs to be repaired. Um, it for sure needs a new paint job. And so it's gone from routine maintenance to more capital improvement or major maintenance. Um,
Mhm.
and so when stuff like that happens, my job is really to make sure that we are trying to keep this system as reliable as possible. And then on the back end of that, communicate risk. Make sure that our stakeholders and our elected representatives understand um, the situation we're in. That hey, these are the condition of these facilities. We've got extensive programs where we go out and inspect and make sure that these things are safe. And if we see anything out of place, we make sure we submit budget packages to try and get funding to go in and replace those. Uh, but like for example, at McAlpin Lock and Dam, um, we went in and replaced the miter gates in the one of the chambers there in 2020. That was a $20 million effort that took place over the course of about 5 months. Similar project at Hamilton in 2022. We're currently in the process of replacing the main service gates at Nolin River Lake. We had one of the gates had some damage on it, so we replaced it, and we've got a package now to replace the other two. There's 3 gates total. And similarly, like it's an Indiana project, but Monroe Lake.
Mhm.
Those, all of this infrastructure is getting to the point where we're seeing more significant failures and are gainfully employed in the operations and maintenance arena to try and keep these things operating as reliably as possible, as long as they possibly can.
Obviously, there's a lot that, goes on at the Louisville district, but what else? What else? Is there anything else that the Louisville district does that's, unique or different?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Corps of Engineers for the Louisville District, primarily, I've been focusing on the civil works mission. So talking about the stuff that's more water related. Um, but our mission also expands into we have a regulatory mission, which is permitting for businesses that might impact the water. So if a business um, has a project that's going to impact a wetland or impact um, a water of the U.S., so something that's like a stream or a creek, then there's a permitting process where our regulatory division will work with them to get an approved process and make sure that the impacts are adequately mitigated. Um, Through that, we have a military mission, which is kind of special for the Louisville district. Not all Army Corps of Engineers districts have a military mission. And so that's support for the state to the military bases, but specific to Kentucky, but um, the whole area. So we've got military bases in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky. Um, so, with the ones in Kentucky, so like Fort Campbell, Fort Knox, um, are we've got construction project offices down there where if Fort Knox wants to build a dining facility or wants to build a new barracks facility, um, then our construction division office will work with them and get a design completed and go out there and administer the construction contract to make sure that the facility is built to the standards in which it was designed. Um, we've got an Air Force and Army Reserves mission, which is nationwide. So even outside our military boundary, that's that kind of um, the regional area. That national mission for the Air Marine Air Force Reserves is constructing reserve centers. And so if Air Force Reserve wants to build a reserve center in Colorado, then we will work with them to make sure they've got a good design and then go out and help them oversee that construction and make sure the quality is what it needs to be and help them just throughout that whole process. Um, we've got planning effort where if a local municipality, say like in Eastern Kentucky. Some of the counties down there, the flooding that's been recently occurring, have reached out to us and said, "Hey, can you study the impacts of the flooding? Look at the water." We have um, engineers who will do models and show, like, all right, if we were to build a flood wall or a levee, we could protect this area or that area. And so there's a lot of planning reports and different things that go into that. And so the district provides that service as well. And last but not least, we have a disaster response mission, and that one's probably a little more visible and prevalent here in the recent past. Um, so nationwide, the Corps of Engineers does disaster response working with FEMA, and the Corps also splits up responsibilities in that. And so the Corps is responsible for things like temporary power. So after a disaster, going out with generators and getting some power reestablished, putting tarps on roofs, so blue roof program, temporary housing, so like going out and putting up um, you know, housing trailers for people to live in temporarily, and then debris removal. And so,
Hmm.
Louisville District, we specify in debris removal. And so that's again a nationwide mission. We've had our teams deploy out to Texas, to Puerto Rico, to Florida, you name it. When there's hurricanes and all the debris that's associated with that, we go out and help work with contractors to clean up all that debris, just because it's far beyond the scale of any individual or local government to get it cleaned up. And then here recently, so like the Eastern Kentucky tornadoes in Mayfield, we had people deployed there cleaning up that debris. The flooding in Western Kentucky, we had people deployed there cleaning up that debris. And then we currently still have people in North Carolina and Western North Carolina cleaning up debris there and working within all the counties that were impacted by that mission. So it's extremely difficult to try and describe all the stuff that goes on in the district. There's around 1,200 people that work for the Louisville District Army Corps of Engineers. Around 700 people here in the federal building downtown, and then the remainder spread out throughout our operational lakes and locks, and then the construction division project offices. So it's broad and vast, and we could. I warned you up front; it was going to be a challenge to try and
Yeah.
do it all in the time
Well,
frame that.
it sounds like that a lot of things going on. The Army Corps of Engineers has a lot of things going on that's helping places run and function that people probably have no idea that's happening.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely a silent partner, kind of in the background and providing benefits that people are unaware of.
What what any like historical anecdotes or stories from the district that listeners might find interesting that well, I mean, obviously they probably don't realize all that the Corps does, but history wise.
Yeah, so for for me personally, one of the most significant things in my career, I had the challenge, the pleasure and opportunity of working on Locking Dam 52 and 53. I was the operations manager, um, trying to keep those facilities operating as they were in a state of active failure. They were from the original canalization, completed in 1928 and 1929, and this was like the 2015 through 2018 timeframe when we were trying to operate those. But I was also charged with transitioning the Olmsted construction project that I mentioned that had been going on for a couple of decades into an operational project. So basically taking this site that was a construction site and making sure we had all the plans and processes and everything in place to get it operational. Um, and we were trying to advance the schedule at Olmsted to get it operational as quickly as possible. Obviously, because of just the time it had been taken, but then too because 52 and 53, the projects that it were replacing were failing faster, and we were at the risk of losing the navigation mission in that stretch of the river, which is the busiest point in the inland waterway system in terms of tonnage. So you're right at the confluence there, the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. Um, but I remember having the conversation. So, long story short, I was trying to balance the risk of, all right, at what point do we stop operating 52 and 53 because we know they're risky. We're putting our employees in harm's way every time we go out there and operate these things. So stuff is breaking around us as we're trying to impound water, and we're standing on vessels from the 1950s,
Yeah.
operating steam powered cranes, and we have these wooden wickets that we're fishing out of the bottom of the river, and they're breaking around us. And so we're hanging off the edge of this like 8 to 10 foot waterfall on a barge, trying to make sure we can get navigable water upstream. So trying to balance that risk and knowing I've got a crew of 10 to 15 people on that vessel, that if something were to go wrong, they would end up in the water. And at that point, you're a low head dam, and you're going to be churned around in that water. So a significant life safety risk. Um, so trying to manage that against, all right, um, if we start operating Olmsted prior to having all the proper plans in place to mitigate that, we run the risk of damaging something. Like so, essentially, if we try to operate it too soon and um, end up breaking something
Yeah.
at the $3 billion facility. One, I don't want that. I don't want the bill for breaking the $3 billion facility, but also don't want the delays, right? Because if we make things worse by breaking something at Olmsted, operating it prematurely without proper training, without the proper equipment, without the proper knowledge that we needed. Um, so I'm trying to balance that, and I remember I was like, I don't know when I'm going to know when that balance is going to tip. Um, but I'm going to rely on the crew to try and help me make that decision, because I don't want to put them in any more harm than I absolutely have to. And so I remember standing out on the deck of the barge at Olmsted as we were doing testing, trying to raise and lower the wickets there, which are now modern and steel. They're much larger. They're 10 foot by 30 foot instead of 4 feet by 20 feet. They're made of steel instead of wood. And we operate them instead of a steam powered crane with a rod that gets thrown off the end of the boat. It's a hydraulic excavator that has GPS and a sonar
Hmm.
camera on it and all kinds of fancy stuff. Um, and so I remember standing out there looking at the crew and like, all right, we're at a point, we got to make a decision here. We're either going to go ahead and go across the river here at Olmsted and impound water, or we're going to pack it up and go back up here to 52 and try this one more time. And oh, by the way, we had done like the one more time, probably like 20 more times. And I remember the crew looking at me being like, I think we're there. Like let's do it. And I knew the significance of that moment. Like, all right, this is gonna change history. Like this is it. We're in impound
Hmm.
water said now, and the river will no longer be the same. And 52 and 53 will no longer be operated, and that will be the end of that era that was originally completed in 1929. So that was really special to be a
Hmm.
part of that decision and get to see that happen.
Yeah. Well, it shows the historical impact that the Corps has had over. Centuries, hundreds of years. Um, where where can listeners learn more about uh, the Army Corps of Engineers, Louisville District, and just stay updated on that on what's going on.
Yeah, so the Louisville district, like everybody else these days, has social media. So we've got a public affairs office that runs a lot of that. So you can just go on Facebook and search for Louisville USACE, USACE, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We're a government agency, so we got to have acronyms. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram. We've got a website. If you just go into Google, type in Louisville District, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. If you recreate at any of our lakes, a lot of our lakes have individual Facebook pages as well, where they post updated lake levels and conditions that are local to that facility, or special events or different things that might be going on. So yeah, just check them out on social media.
It's a great part of Kentucky history. I think definitely people don't notice or even consider that this started 250 years ago and helped really shape a lot of the infrastructure. You mentioned the lakes and stuff. I don't think people really understand or connect that that's an infrastructure planned out for many decades. Um,
Right.
to prevent a lot of hard times if they weren't there. Um, well, anything else before we wrap it up?
No, I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity. I know it's a lot to cover, and so I appreciate the listeners, hanging in there and sticking with the uh, me trying to tie it all back together, and multiple things going on. I'm growing up, I was never what I considered a history buff, but having my career take the path that it has, I can't help but be interested in history and how these projects, to me, it just helps put things into context and have proper perspective and appreciation for the job that I have now, and how it fits in to places like the state of Kentucky. So
Yeah.
yeah, really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, well, there's plenty more history I'm sure we can talk about, so you're welcome to come on anytime and we'll talk more about it. Again, 250th anniversary for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And is that the Louisville District too, or just the whole Corps of Engineers, right?
That's for the whole Corps of Engineers. The Louisville District is right at 200 years. I think ours was 1775.
Gotcha. Well,
No, I'm sorry. Hold on. Let me get the dates right. Yeah, 1875 is when the Corps of Engineers in Louisville District really got its start. I knew it was a 75. I was just off by 100 years.
that's all right. That's all right. Well, yeah. Well, thanks again, Waylon, for coming on and talking to us about it. It's a lot of good Kentucky history. Anything else before we go?
No, man. My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.